For more videos on people's struggles, please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Hello, welcome to People's Dispatch and Globetrotter. Very pleased today to have with us Loki. Loki, of course, known to many people as the musician who gave us Dear Listener and the trilogy, well, almost trilogy, one more to come, Soundtrack to the Struggle. The first volume out 2011, then 2019, and the third one coming soon. Important contribution to music, of course, but also to communicating a political consciousness. Loki, welcome to People's Dispatch and Globetrotter.
Thank you so much for having me, Vijay. And, it's important that you know that everybody was kung fu fighting, darker nations. These were really integral parts of my political development. So it's really special for me to be here with you now.
Now, you're too kind. I want to come straight to the problem of a particular fire that took place in London, in North Kensington, I believe, the Grenfell Tower fire. We're coming up to the 4th anniversary of this fire. The 14th of June 2017 was the event. By August of that year, you released a very powerful song and video called Ghosts of Grenfell. I watched that several times. In the song, you write, "The blood is on your hands." I mean, there's some really powerful lines in that song.
The night our eyes changed. Rooms where love was made and unmade in a flash of the night. Rooms where memories drowned in fumes of poison. Rooms where futures were planned and the imagination of children built castles in the sky. Rooms where both the extraordinary and the mundane were lived, become forever tortured graves of ash. Oh, you political class, so servile to corporate power.
Did they die or us? Did they die or us? Did they die for
Ghosts of Grenfell still calling for justice, not hear them scream.
Did they die or us? Did they die or us? Did they die for
This corporate manslaughter will haunt you, not hear them scream. Words cannot express, please allow me to begin though. 1:30 a.m, heard the shouting from my window. People crying in the street, watching the burning of their kinfolk. Grenfell Tower now, historically a symbol. People reaching from their windows, screaming for their lives, pleading with their cries, trying to reason with the skies. They all youth birth champions. Comparison is clear though, that every single person in that building was a hero. So don't judge our tired eyes in these trying times, cause we've been breathing in cyanide the entire night. They say Yasin saw the fire and he ran inside. Who thought that would be the site where he and his family died? The street is like a graveyard, tombstone lurching over us. Those shouting out to their windows now wish they never woke them up. Wouldn't hope your worst enemy to go in this position. Now it's flowers for the dead and printing posters for the missing. Come home, come home.
Did they die or us? Did they die or us? Did they die for
Ghosts of Grenfell still calling for justice, not hear them scream.
Did they die or us? Did they die or us? Did they die for
This corporate manslaughter will haunt you, not hear them scream.
That event says something about Great Britain in our time, Loki. Can you talk a little bit about what Grenfell meant and what it continues to mean to you?
Well, firstly, I live opposite Grenfell Tower and have lived here for 20 years. A friend of mine and his family died in there on the night. We saw people in the windows trying to get help to escape. So it's really etched on my mind in a very visceral way, the scenes I saw that night. But Grenfell was the local manifestation of a global problem. This was the physical, clear appearance of three main things around neoliberalism. So firstly, it was the conversion of local governments into entrepreneurial forces that fight for capital before they protect human life. It was a manifestation of austerity, and it was also a manifestation of national deregulation of the construction industry. To understand the community, you have to really look back and see what built this area. Around 1896, you had an infant mortality rate in the area, then known as Nottingdale, which was leaving about 43 children out of 100 dying before they reached the age of 1. It was an extremely poor area known for the keeping of pigs and the potteries. Most of the land was owned by a man called Richard Labrook, and that's the reason the area later became Labrook Grove. Colonialism shaped it. The colonial capital is what shaped this place. The Portobello Farm, which was named after a British battle with the Spanish, capturing a port of Panama, led to the naming of the area as Portobello after the particular port. But you had in 1833 what was a huge influx of money that was represented by the Earl Grey, who is known now for tea, but at that time he was the Conservative Prime Minister, abolishing of slavery following the rebellion in Jamaica, and of course rebellions in other parts of the British Empire. But what that was, in fact, was a transfer of £20 million in compensation to the slave traders, the people who owned humans. In today's money, that is the equivalent of £2.2 billion. Now, one of the recipients of this blood money was a man by the name of John White. Now, he used some of that money to build something called the Hippodrome at that time, that many of the local villagers were deeply opposed to, as it encroached upon their land and cut off their footpath. They protested, they wrote letters, they distributed petitions, they threatened people that were trying to go to the Hippodrome and saw it as a den of vice. It got so bad that jockeys and trainers who would race horses there refused to work there because of how controversial it was for them. And in fact, their cause was picked up by the Times newspaper. And believe it or not, the pressure from the Times newspaper forced John White to acquiesce to the villagers' demands. So really, from that period of time, it's an area where political agitation has been an integral part of everyday life. But to understand the makeup of the area in terms of people and where they come from, you have to look at World War II, a situation where 30% of the homes in England were destroyed or damaged. Infant mortality was 10 times what it is today, and 20,000 people died in 1 year from tuberculosis. The infrastructure of Britain was completely destroyed by German bombs, and countless men of working age were lost. Britain was also in debt. It was at that point it sent out invitations to the colonies. The British Nationality Act of 1947 meant that everyone that was part of the British Empire was a British citizen and were able to travel to the quote unquote motherland. This led to the Windrush. But when those people came from the Caribbean, they were not welcomed in Britain. We know that during World War II, the non-white soldiers had been forced into Jim Crow-like segregation by the US forces working with the British troops. But also, we saw a situation where Labrook Grove was one of the only places that the words "no blacks, no dogs, and no Irish" were not pinned on the doors. So it was one of the only places that people coming from the Caribbean could rent rooms and in some cases buy property. However, as things developed from the late 40s to the 50s going forward, there was a campaign led by Oswald Mosley, who was an aristocrat originally, who was conservative, then Labour, then British Union of Fascists, to agitate and push white people in the area, not Irish people, but people that see themselves as British, to target these new arrivals, to firebomb their homes in the road that is overlooked today by Grenfell Tower, the road I live on. There were 4 days of riots in which houses that it was believed Caribbean people lived in were firebombed by the Teddy Boys and those close to Oswald Mosley. In 1959, an Antiguan plumber by the name of Kelso Cole-Crane, he was a carpenter actually, was killed in Ladbroke Grove. Now, it was that murder and the lack of accountability and the willingness of the authorities, despite knowing who killed him, to not push for any charges, that led to the assertion of Caribbean culture, which is the Notting Hill Carnival. It's the biggest street carnival in Europe and brings in 1.5 million people every year. Now, this carnival developed out of that resistance to this not only societal, but also in many cases, governmental discrimination that people from the Caribbean faced. Ladbroke Grove is the area that Bob Marley recorded Exodus. It's the area that Jimi Hendrix died in. You know, the Clash obviously gravitated to the Westway, which winds past Grenfell Tower. Now, when we look at the how it transpired to have this poisonous cladding put on the side of the building, we cannot look at Grenfell as completely detached from the Kyoto Agreement, because when the British government came out of it, they had an obligation to lower carbon emissions. And one of the lobby groups waiting for the British government at that time was Brofuma. So they were a group of foam insulation companies who lobbied the British government and persuaded them to not only subsidize them, but support them plastering cladding on residential buildings across the country. The problem was, though, that since Thatcher had taken building regulations, which at the time were 324 pages, and replaced them with about 25 pages, from when building regulations had gone from prescriptive in terms of material to being performance-based, what it meant was that these companies were able to more cheaply get materials onto buildings that turn out to be very dangerous. We also see the privatization of BRE, which was the Building Research Establishment. It is the mechanism through which the British government tests these materials. It was privatized during the Blair years, and the privatization meant that BRE was reliant on money from the insulation industry in order to keep it afloat. So that logic, that neoliberal logic, was active in these different ostensibly institutions of government. Now, when we look at the 3 manifestations of neoliberalism that led to the fire, we look at, as I said, number 1, the council working for private interests. That's local government that changed the choice of cladding from a zinc fire-resistant cladding to an arconic 5 millimeters of polyethylene cladding, which was chosen in the end. It was called PE Renabond. But the philosophical basis for the council's disdain for people living in social housing was, as put in this way by a main figure at the council, their belief that social housing embeds disempowerment. They were dealing with this community with a form of managed decline. The idea was to run down the area and then demolish the homes and replace them with more expensive and smaller private properties that could be sold to global capital, really. And prior to the fire, I was involved in something called the Save Our Silchester campaign, because we saw that actually the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower that led to it being clad was a concession. Originally, the plan was for all of the blocks in the area to be knocked down and replaced with more expensive places. So we, and this is the twisted irony in it, perceived those that lived in Grenfell Tower to be safe, while the rest of us were in danger of losing our homes. So the twisted irony is, in fact, that cladding, which was chiseled to the side of the building, was a nail in the coffin of the inhabitants that lived there. The second part of neoliberalism that played a part in this fire was deregulation. So we know that Michael Heseltine, who was in the Thatcher government, he passed the Building Regulations Act, which I mentioned before. And in his exact words, he said, this will allow for greater industry self-regulation. Approved document B, while there were several fires, this was an important part of the building regulations, which, had it been tightened, it would have given more clarity. Because, you know, the thing is these companies take creative ambiguities and stretch them out as far as they possibly can. Now, had approved document B been dealt with adequately, it would have removed the creative ambiguities from the regulations. However, he did not do that. But it was not only the Conservative government that did not deal with approved document B after several fires, it was also John Prescott of the Blair government. They continuously sat on this duty that they were, in fact, recommended after different inquests into the deaths of other fires that preceded Grenfell, like Lakanal Tower also. But the other part of deregulation was that companies like Celotex, who provided the insulation, which was an important part of the fire, along with the archonic cladding, they put on their website in 2011, this company called Celotex, they are a subsidiary of Saint-Gobain. On their website, they put the following words: "We have entered government and we are now shaping building regulations to maximize profit to our industry." They even rented out a bright pink bus and plastered it with the words, "Building regulations are changing, go with Celotex." Now imagine, during the inquiry, Saint-Gobain, the parent company of Celotex, actually had the audacity to suggest that those people that died in the tower could have died from pre-existing medical conditions. We also know that Celotex's technical director, a man by the name of Mark Allen, was an advisor on building regulations to the housing minister at the time of the fire, who goes by the name of Sajid Javid. What the inquiry has revealed is that all of these companies knew the material they were using was combustible and were only doing it because they knew that the British regulatory system was adequately penetrated by them and people with interests like them for Britain to be a suitable market. The last point, of course, is austerity. You had a fire brigade that had £100 million cut from it. The fire doors had not been put in place. Gas pipes were exposed along the stairway. You had a cut for funding for the fire service in the borough by 50%, despite the fact that deaths by fire had increased by 20%. The fire brigade went in with walkie-talkies that didn't work. And also there was a stay put policy at work in the fire, meaning that if you were dealing with a building that didn't have flammable cladding on the outside of it, then people should stay put to avoid a stampede and isolate the fire. Now, A previous fire that had taken place at Trellick Tower, which is a stone's throw from Grenfell, 2 weeks ago had led to 0 casualties, but that's because the outside of the building was brick, not flammable equivalent of petrol, essentially. Now that stay put policy was deemed to have failed by 1:23 a.m., but it was only changed to a policy of evacuation at 2:37 a.m. 107 people were still in the building at that point, and only 36 of them got out alive. We also know that 29 fire engines had been lost from London, and that the experts within the fire brigade had been cut by a third. So it is here that we see all of these things come together to cause this fire. What we were dealing with was a situation that was actually far more widespread than we knew. By some estimations, there are over 1 million people in the country who currently have unsafe materials in their buildings. Now, this has caused a crash in some ways to the housing market. Flat sales of leasehold flats in this country have gone down by 50%. Now, this is a core contradiction showing itself in capital, because essentially the idea of asset owning democracy of property owners that Thatcher envisioned is leading these people to nothing but bankruptcy, suicidal thoughts, and in fact, despair. And there were many surveys carried out with people inside these properties, and it was found that 9 out of 10 of these leaseholders in unsafe cladded flats have said that their mental health has deteriorated as a result. 23% of them have said that they have considered self-harm or suicide. So this is a major alienation, which even we've seen since 2019, 76 schools, 25 hospitals and care homes, and 11 university buildings built with combustible cladding. So this is how malignant this penetration of regulatory bodies is in this country. Unfortunately, Grenfell was the victim of a bipartisan orthodoxy of neoliberal necro-politics that had wrapped the invisible hand of the market in the iron glove of the state.
Well, let's come to that because this is an amazing story of how the ruling elites have a contempt for people. That they are pledged in one way or the other to govern. I mean, this is a government. There's a sense of contempt in the story that you've told. We've experienced this contempt in the hundreds of years of imperialism. And then in the recent period, you released a song which would have been, I suppose, or is going to be in soundtrack to the struggle part 3, which was called Iraq2Chile. I found that a very interesting song because I know that much of your activism has been around against the US war in Iraq, the horrendous occupation of the Palestinians. I know that this song was occasioned by the protests in Chile. In the song you write, neocon wars make neoliberal utopias. Neoliberal utopias, of course, then you say there's a transgenerational trauma. Neoliberal utopia is, of course, a country without the poor, a country without the working class. As you say, let's make the building into disrepair so people have to leave, and then we can enclose it, in a new kind of enclosure movement. Reflect a little bit on the relationship between Iraq2Chile, let's say, and the world of Grenfell, that world of imperialism and the world of the people, 72 people martyred at Grenfell Towers.
This is for the martyrs of hope, reaching, yearning, extending their arms towards a freedom which they never quite reach in their lives. This is for you. Neoliberalism kills people, the burden of business. Believe me, you never heard a verse as urgent as this is. Merciless, murky mercenaries merge with merchants of mischief. Murder wishes, kill dreams and hopes and disturb the infants. It's not about Joker, metro tickets and WhatsApp. It's about the gap between have-lots and do not haves. Your fake bomb detectors can't stop that. Embezzle billions in the name of a non-existent social contract. Analysis, defeat hanging, dangling from the leg. Still staggering from expired gas canisters in the head. It's not about pity, hands out or sympathy. It's about employment, water and electricity. Autumn of discontent, the spring was a lost memory. Hybrid war combined with economic shock therapy. Sectarianism buries vision beyond what's revealed. Corruption guards an economic model that kills. Neocon wars make neoliberal utopias. Intergenerational traumas on all forms of phobia. Wrote death into the constitution like snipers in chairs. Birds fall from the sky as tear gas privatizes the air. Those that passed, I kiss the soles of your feet. You inspired us, tireless in the face of violent tyrants, till your eyes were shut, defiant lions. Every side of the street you defy the thug's rebellion, the purest expression of a vital type of love.
عيب يا ولي عيب لا خلي يصير عندك شرف وين شرفنا احنا البنات يصيح عند الشارع
They say the IMF requires death, the snipers fire at a child's chest. They say the IMF requires death, the snipers fire at a child's chest.
أحلامنا سرقوها آمالنا دمروها عالحائط كتبوها أسماء الشهداء أحلامنا سرقوها.
Well, firstly, the invasion occupation in 2003 established an unregulated space for commercial activity. It was a bonanza of corporate profit for many different actors. It establishes spaces without a coherent social contract. And essentially that is what was missing at Grenfell, was the social contract. And that is what was established in Iraq, and a rapid process of re-regulation as sort of shock therapy. And it's a sort of irresolvable contradiction where you have a military rule of law for the population, but a lawless zone for corporate power. And that transition from command economy to neoliberal economy was led by the CPA. It issued 100 legally binding administrative orders by decree. For example, Order 12 was the eradication of import tariffs and trade barriers. Order 30 was the deregulation of wage protection in the labor market. Order 37 was tax reform. They reformed the banking sector, making Iraq constantly chained to the US banking system. The privatization of state enterprise was in the administrative order by Paul Bremer of 39. And you have to remember that 39 actually had within it full private ownership of state-owned enterprise. And it said that instantly 200 state-owned enterprises would be dismantled, from electricity to telecommunications to the pharmaceutical functions of the government, had 100% foreign ownership of banks, mines, and factories. And 3 firms were allowed to move their profits out of the country by that Article 39. You know, Article 55 of the CPA's CPA administration's rules was that, you know, you are putting them in a position where they are in direct violation of international law that says it is illegal to privatize a country's assets while it is under occupation of a military power. Now, when the occupation happened, you had over 500,000 Iraqis lose their job instantly. And also a process of deindustrialization, whereas before the occupation, Iraq's exports, whether it was dates or leather, were essential to this staggered, beaten and battered economy by over a decade of the most comprehensive sanctions in history. The United States stopped using the pesticide on the palm trees, and that led to the date industry dying because those trees died. And as anyone who knows anything about the trees knows, that they take about 15 to 20 years to grow before the dates can bear fruit. So with that one move, they destroyed the date industry. The leather industry, like I say, it went from employing 200,000 people before the occupation to only employing about 20,000 people. You were really in a situation where it was made a complete playground of all of the worst corporate interests in the world. When you look at Kellogg Brown and Root, subsidiary of Halliburton, who, you know, Dick Cheney owned shares in, while he wasn't still in his position there, he still owned shares in it. They were awarded a $7 billion contract a week before the invasion, which was one of the largest no-bid contracts in US history. Shell and BP in 2008 also won no-bid contracts. It's also important to question on this issue of reparations that actually reparations have been paid for the Iraq war. They just haven't been paid to Iraqis. So lost profits or decline of business, as they were defined, due to the rule of Saddam Hussein's government, meant that the US directly paid $11 million of Iraqis' money to the Sheraton Hotel Enterprise, $7 million to Bechtel, $3.8 million to Pepsi. Kentucky Fried Chicken got over $250,000. Toys R Us got $200,000. And even Israeli farmers got $8 million supposedly for lost profits during Saddam's rule. And even Israeli hoteliers and travel agencies collected $15 million for reparations that they were supposedly said to have lost during the previous government. So we are talking about this application of neoliberal economics through the iron fist of the state, in the same way that Henry Kissinger put Pinochet in Chile to do. This is what happened in Iraq in 2003. And as I say, many generations have been lost to this understanding of economics that leads to death. It's necro-political. However, it's less spectacular, the violence that takes place on paper that leads to death, as the kind of violence that you see from bombs and other things.
From Chile to Iraq to Grenfell Towers, Loki, thanks for joining us on People's Dispatch and Globetrotter.
Thank you for having me.